Warframe has a lot of different builds and playstyles, but out of everything, there's that one primal part of my brain which simply loves pressing only one button and then blowing up the entire screen. And I know you feel it too. So, in this video, I'm gonna show you the best Nuke Warframes to do exactly that. We'll go over both how they work and also how you need to build them for that big kaboom. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now, let's go. Before we get into the first contender, I want to make one quick disclaimer. The frames on today's list are not the be-all end-all. There are a lot of other builds and synergies that you can use to also clear the entire screen, so of course, in my list, personal opinion is involved. If your personal favorite nuking setup was not on the list, then let me know in the comments down below so that maybe I can even make a follow-up. And then secondly, and this is probably even a bit more important, as I said, yes, we're gonna look at builds for every Warframe on today's list, but we're unfortunately not gonna have enough time to deep dive into every single one and explain why I chose the individual mods. So, in case you find something today especially interesting and you want to learn more about the Warframe, then I would highly recommend checking out a dedicated guide on that Warframe alone. I also have videos on my channel about every single one on the list, except maybe Nezha. He's still on my to-do list. And now that I already mentioned him, Nezha! Yeah, Nezha is on the list, so why not start out with him right off the bat? First of all, when it comes to Nezha, he is still very high on my to-do list for 2026. However, even without having made a dedicated guide on him yet, I do very much appreciate the nuking capabilities that the man has. What we're talking about in specific here is Nezha's fourth ability, Divine Spears. At base, this is nothing to necessarily write home about, because it's more of a crowd-controlling ability. It impales enemies around you with spears, and then they can't move. However, there is an augment, and this is one of the sickest and most disgusting augments in the entire game, which goes by the name Divine Retribution. What this augment does is, when you inflict status effects to one of the impaled enemies, then each and every other impaled enemy is also gonna eat the exact same status effects. And as if that's not crazy enough, when the duration of those spears ends, then for every impaled enemy, the game calculates how much damage over time status effects they have on them, and how much damage over time they would have yet to receive of those DOT ticks, and instead, the game takes all that damage, combines it into one huge number, and deals it to them in one big instance. With, of course, an additional damage multiplier on top, because hey, it's not like it's strong enough already, right? Just in case you found the explanation a little bit complicated, it's actually pretty darn simple. You cast Divine Spears, inflict tons of status effects to one of the enemies, and then once the duration ends, all that damage over time is gonna blow up the entire screen. That's really all there is to it. The, of course, best way to capitalize on this synergy is to use a weapon that deals tons of damage over time status effects, because remember, it's only the status effects that are gonna get spread, not the actual damage that you deal. If you want to have some weapon suggestions, the Furies Incarnon is pretty darn strong. We have status shotguns like the Convectrix, the Phantasma, the Phage. I have videos on all of them already. And in general, every weapon that is very big into damage over time. A quick additional tip, if you want to amp up the final nuke damage of Divine Spears even more, then mod your weapon for status duration, because remember, the game sums up all the remaining DOT that would have yet to be inflicted. So if the status duration is longer, that makes more damage ticks, meaning even more kablooey. I personally use this Nezha build together with the Harmony because without wasting too much time, the Harmony itself is already an absolutely disgusting nuking weapon, and in the hands of Nezha, it can just one-hit everybody on screen. This right here is the build that you're seeing in the background. However, I should say one thing about it. This build is tailor-made to be used with the Harmony. If, instead, you want to use Nezha with a gun, then most people prefer to use Transient Fortitude and maybe even Fleeting Expertise to artificially lower your ability duration, because this way, the Divine Spears only last for like 1 or 2 seconds, which makes it much more convenient to play. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that'd be super nice, because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support! Up next, we have somebody who might sound like a huge contradiction, and that would be Trinity. Now, you might think, what does the dedicated healer and support frame do on a nuke list? Well, let me introduce you to not necessarily a new, but still very fun niche build. What this all is based on is Trinity's skill Energy Vampire. At base, what this does is you mark an enemy with it, and then that enemy will emit energy pulses, which charges up the energy of you and nearby allies. At the same time though, each and every one of those energy pulses will also damage the enemy a bit. But this is not just an upfront damage, no, it is a percentage-based damage that scales with the enemy's health. So yeah, with enough buffs and strengths, we can take down the health of the marked enemy regardless of their level. But then, how do we turn the whole thing into a nuke? Well, to do that, we're gonna use a helmet ability in the form of Marked for Death. This skill is very simple because all it does is you mark one enemy, and then the next damage instance that this enemy takes will be dealt outwards in an AoE around them to every other foe as well. So you can see where that goes, right? Mark an enemy, then cast your Energy Vampire on them, and then the percentage-based true damage that they're taking, now everybody around them takes that too. This is, of course, especially strong if you cast it on an enemy with a lot of health, because more maximum health means more damage dealt. However, in practice you can also come by pretty nicely if you do a little bit of viral priming to make the enemies weaker. Ideally, I would use the Panzerwölperpfeiler as my companion of choice so that the viral priming is even a bit more passive. This right here is the Trinity build that you're seeing in the background, and to be 100% fair, this playstyle tends to be a little bit inconsistent at times. Sometimes you're aiming at one enemy but then the skill accidentally hits someone else, sometimes you might target a weaker enemy which reduces the overall damage, and viral priming is sadly a must. However, even though there are some ifs and buts with this, I still think it is absolutely hilarious that we can turn our support medic frame into literally one of the best nukes in the game, which is why I absolutely wanted to share this with you. Okay, up next we need to talk about the literal nuke king of Warframe. I mean, when I made a video on him back in the day, I literally had this thumbnail right here. Of course, I'm talking about Sevagoth. What we're using right here to make the nuke happen is his first and his second ability, both with their respective augments. Sevagoth's second ability puts a sort of debuff on the enemy, which makes him take a little bit of true damage over time. His first ability at base shoots out a shadow version of himself that, when it comes close to enemies, gives them another debuff called Death Harvest, which gives the enemy damage vulnerability. The crazy synergy though happens when we put both skills together, because if that shadow that you shoot out with your first touches an enemy that has the debuff from your second, then that enemy is dealt 25% of their current health as true damage and will detonate, dealing the same as blast damage to all enemies in a 4-meter radius. These figures here of course scale with ability strength. So, the way you play this is, inflict the debuff with your second, then shoot the shadow through, and with enough ability strength, the enemy is going to die. But that's still not it, because as I said, we're also going to use the augment. First of all, the augment for his second is pretty straightforward. When an enemy with that debuff dies, this debuff will spread in an AoE around said enemy. And then the Shadow Haze augment for your shadow, this makes it that, when enemies die, they can spawn more of these shadows up to a maximum of 3. Now, when we put all of this together, the damage vulnerability, the true damage spread, the spreading of the debuff, and then having 3 of those shadows damaging the enemies at the same time, not just 1, then what we're getting is what you see in the background right here, right? You cast the skills once, deleting absolutely everybody on screen. This right here is the build that I was using in the background, and if you haven't already, then you should definitely give this Sevagoth synergy a try. By the way, the build might be a teensy tiny little bit outdated because it was from an old video, so I might give it a touch up in 2026 if I have time for it. It still works very well though. The next Warframe on the list is actually the newest in the roster, and that would be Uriel. Uriel is a ridiculous nuke, and he comes actually pretty close to that very definition because his AoE has really no restrictions. It ignores line of sight, it has no issues with enemy elevation or them being behind something. No, when you press the 4 on Uriel, then absolutely everything in the AoE will be hit. Here's how it works. With Uriel's 4, there is one special thing to keep in mind. you can't just spam it because, as you see in the bottom right corner of the screen, there is a little charge meter, and you can only use that fourth ability when the charge meter is full. Question would be, how do we fill it up? And there are actually two ways that work very well here. On the one hand, Uriel has this whole feature with his 3 little friends that are floating around him and want you to interact with them in a certain way, but essentially interacting with whatever your little minions are doing gives you a bunch of charge whenever you do it. And then another thing that I noticed is, your third ability, if you spam that ability very hard, then this will also rapidly increase the meter for your 4. And then, once the 4 is charged, you press it and you create a large fire AoE around you. Enemies in this area will rapidly eat heat status over time effects, like you can see it in the background. It's crazy how fast it goes. And as if that's not enough, the damage for each and every one of those status effects will increase with each consecutive heat proc to a maximum of 10 times. What this means is, with enough ability strength and ideally Archon Vitality to double the heat procs even further, absolutely everybody in the AoE is gonna melt. This right here is the build that I'm using in the background, and also here, my Uriel guide is only a couple of weeks old, still very much up to date, so if you want to know more details about him, definitely make sure to check that out later. Okay, up next we have Khora, and before I say anything, I think this one clip from one of my old streams sums it up pretty nicely. But I'm gonna keep it real with Khora, it's just... Was that 114 million Ethiotic? One little disclaimer right off the bat, Khora has sort of multiple ways to nuke. If you like, you could as well use her Whip Claw or her Whip Claw in combination with her Strangle Dome. That is the standard playstyle on her. But today, I want to focus on Venari in specific because I think it's one of the most underrated abilities in the entire game. See, as we all know, Khora has her loyal companion Venari, and Venari is going to be with her no matter if you use the Venari ability, her 3, or if you subzoom over it, right? The companion Venari is always going to be there. What the Venari ability does is multiple things. I don't want to get too much into the details, but at base, this looks really not all that impressive, which is why usually everybody subzooms over it. The kicker here though, and what I think is the most underrated thing, is that this ability enables you to mark an enemy and give Venari a dedicated attack command on said enemy. This puts Venari leagues over every other type of companion because you don't have to deal with weird companion AI. Mark it for Venari, and Venari is going to teleport to that enemy and instantly take them out. Now, how does this help us nuke the room? Well, the culprit in this case, let's call it that, would be the mod Contagious Bond. With this one, when you put it on Venari, then that makes it that when Venari takes out an enemy, a portion of the status effects that the enemy has is going to be dealt in an AoE to enemies around them. And then all we gotta make sure is that our Venari has a very strong build with her claws and deals a lot of damage over time status effects, because that will make Venari super duper strong, instantly take out the enemy that you mark, and spread all of this super powerful status out, which then creates these ridiculous chain reactions that you're also seeing in the background. To be 100% fair, if you want to get the absolute most out of it, then there's a lot of weapon Warframe companion synergies going on in this loadout, so if it sounds fun to you, definitely make sure to check out my full Khora guide where I explain it in more detail. But to save time for the sake of this video, this right here is the Khora build, this right here is the build that I have on Venari, and this is the Venari Claws build. Up next, we need to talk about a couple of Warframes, and it might be a bit of a stretch to some, because it's not necessarily the frames that we're talking about, but a specific weapon Warframe synergy. However, it's so ridiculously strong that it would be a loss if we don't mention it. And that would be the Kuva Sobek as a weapon, with the Acid Shell's Augment, in the hands of any type of Warframe that is able to give it an elemental imbuement. First of all, as a quick side note, maybe for the newer players among you, the special thing about imbuements, contrary to normal infusions, is that an imbuement makes it that your weapon hits actually trigger a separate damage instance of that imbued element, which in its damage is based on your weapon scaling in some form. At first, this sounds like two sides of the same coin, right? But for specific synergies, having a separate damage instance breaks the game in very funny ways. And it just so happens that the Kuva Sobek with Acid Shells is exactly that. See, what the Acid Shell's augment does is, when you take out an enemy with the Kuva Sobek, then they will explode outwards and deal damage in an AoE. Because that explosion was caused by you killing an enemy with the weapon, then those hits are also technically considered hits inflicted by the weapon itself. And with an elemental imbuement, we get a second damage instance to every enemy that we hit with the weapon. This means that the explosion caused by acid shells taxis the elemental imbuement from your Warframe, which then creates these ridiculous chain reactions that you see on screen in the background. As for the builds itself, it's actually not all that important how you do it. You just need to make sure that you have the Kuva Sobek with the Acid Shell's augment, and then some sort of elemental imbuement. Okay, next we have a Warframe whom, up until recently, I would not have seen on a top Nuke Frames list, but now he belongs here, and his name is Vauban. At base, Vauban is usually considered to be more of a crowd control frame, and he definitely excels in that role, but he also comes with one skill called Photon Strike. This one can be explained very easily. You throw out a targeting beacon, and then like half a second later, a ginormous orbital strike will come down and deal blast damage to everybody who comes too close. This orbital strike, though, deals scaling damage, meaning the higher the health and the level of the enemy, the more damage you deal, which means it scales very well in longer endurance content. However, there is one little problem with calling this ability a nuke, and that is that the range of this photon strike is really small, so here's the synergy that fixes that. When you use your fourth ability, Bastille, then you can create a vortex that pulls in enemies in a larger AoE. And if you then throw a photon strike, then the targeting beacon is going to get sucked into the vortex, making the photon strike hit the entire enemy blob. However, we are not done yet, because Photon Strike also has an augment called Photon Repeater. This one is very good for this Photon Strike playstyle, because it makes it that when you at least hit 5 enemies with your Photon Strike, then the next cast will be free, and it will trigger additional Photon Strikes on the same position. This is obviously ridiculously good, because it means more damage, more blast, and because the enemies are blobbed up, this secondary explosion from the blast proc, that is also not to be underestimated. Just real quick, one thing that I forgot to mention, if you want to deal the maximum damage possible with this, you gotta have Roar as a subsume ability because it massively increases your ability damage. This right here in the background is the build that I'm using, and again, if you want to have a full explanation of that very build, you'll find that in my recent Vauban video. The next frame on our list would be Gara, and this one I think I'm going to keep very short because nuke as a term might be a bit of a stretch for what's happening here, but I also think she still somewhat fits on the list. Let me explain. For Gara, it's really as simple as it gets. You have your first ability, your Exalted Glass Sword, and with this one you can basically play Warframe Tinder and swipe over the screen to delete all enemies in a cone in front of you. The damage here is ridiculously high, and as an added bonus, this glass blade that you swipe in front of you also has infinite punch through, so it doesn't have any line of sight requirement. If there's a red dot on the map somewhere remotely in front of you, they're gonna be gone afterwards. The only little weakness here would be elevated enemies because the swipe is purely horizontal, but still it is incredible fun to play, you get ridiculously high kills per minute, and on top of that, Gara has so much more on offer. Check out my dedicated Gara guide if you want to learn about all of her features. For the time being though, this right here is the Gara build that you're seeing in the background, and also this right here is the build for Shattered Flash that you see in the background. You don't need to 100% copy it, it's going to be strong enough with a standard build anyway. And last, but definitely not least, I also want to talk about Gauss. Because Gauss and Grendel will soon get new skins, which look nice, and I'm going to make an updated build, so why not give you a little bit of an appetizer before that? When it comes to nuking with Gauss, there is one skill that we need to look at, and that is, of course, Thermal Sunder. This one creates an AoE around you, and this AoE can either inflict cold or heat damage to the enemies. By default, if you hold the ability button while casting, it's going to be a heat DOT. If you tap the button, you get the cold one. The special part about this skill is that the elements inflicted by it can actually combine into blast. So if you cast a Heat Sunder on enemies affected by cold, or you cast a Cold Sunder on enemies affected by heat, then you're actually going to deal blast damage to them. But that's not all. See, the height of that blast damage that you deal depends on how many status procs are on the enemy. So, for example, if the enemy has one heat effect on them, that's not going to be all too strong. However, if the enemy has a bunch of heat on them, and then you trigger the blast with a Cold Sunder, it's going to be much stronger. And this scales incredibly quickly. However, Thermal Sunder not only creates these blasts based on the status effects that come from Thermal Sunder, no, you could also go and inflict tons of heat with weapons, and then cast only one Cold Sunder to instantly blow them up as well. For today though, this right here is the build that you're seeing in the background. And now, check out my full Warframe 2026 tier list here to see how today's Warframes compare to the rest. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Lost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkane02, Skylar Bowser, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morazaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantagas, Patrisator, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awendai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.